Hi, I'm Piper Harris, a licensed professional counselor, and welcome to the Untangled Mind podcast. This is a show for people who want to understand why their mind works the way it does, not just how to cope with it. Drawing from neuropsychology, neurophilosophy, and data-driven CBT, we look at how anxiety and trauma shape perception, behavior, and choice, and what actually helps people change. I'm an integrative CBT therapist based in the Atlanta suburbs. Each episode is designed to teach you something concrete: how to recognize what's keeping you stuck, how to interrupt unhelpful patterns, and how to move forward with clarity and steadiness. Today, we enter into stage 2 of the Triphasic trauma model, Remembrance and Mourning. This stage is where the survivor begins the careful, often demanding work of reconstructing the trauma story so that it can be integrated rather than remain fragmented and intrusive. Once a foundation of safety is in place, the work shifts. The survivor is invited to tell the story of the trauma, completely, in depth, and in detail. This is not simple recounting, it's reconstruction, weaving together facts, emotions, bodily sensations, and shattered meanings into a coherent narrative. This stage carries both pain and profound possibility. It asks the survivor to face existential questions that trauma raises and to mourn what was lost. It requires a therapist who can serve as a steady, compassionate witness. This is for survivors who sense they may be ready for this phase, loved ones seeking to understand the process, and clinicians committed to ethical, effective, trauma-informed practice. Please know, this episode explores the reconstruction of traumatic memories, emotional reliving, existential questioning, grief, and mourning. While avoid graphic details, the concepts can still evoke strong responses. Please prioritize your safety, pause, use grounding techniques, or seek support as needed. Let's begin. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm excited to dig back into this series on the triphasic model. This was spearheaded by Judith Herman. If you've not heard the previous podcast, please go back and listen to those. I'll also put those in the show notes, some links for that, just so that you understand really what we're digging into. So really the triphasic model, this is how I have created the Untangled Mind pathway. And this is really what is key for clinicians to understand. This is well-documented, well-researched, evidence-based process, and it really keeps our clients, our patients safe when we enter into trauma processing. The reason I've chosen, again, to kind of go back a little bit to speak about this, and specifically this model, is that unfortunately I've seen a lot of individuals claiming trauma-informed, but they don't know what the triphasic model is, and they're not really clear about what takes place. And I just think that for us to be the best clinicians for those humans that just desperately need our care, we need to understand these things to keep them the most safe. So today we are stepping into stage 2, and so Judith Herman, she is absolutely unequivocal that the central task, of this triphasic model is the second stage, and that is called remembrance and mourning, or you can think of this as trauma narrative or exposure. So this work can only begin once stage 1 is absolutely solidified. So that's safety. We talked about that in the previous podcast, So safety has to be really established, and we'll really get into depth with it. I'm really going to harp on safety being that stage being really solidified. But if you attempt to go into stage 2 prematurely, what happens is that it really risks flooding the survivor and worsening symptoms. So we really have to be careful. And what I want to say about stage 2, it's not just about narration of a trauma. The goal is actually integration. So I think oftentimes people hear, I need to do EMDR or I need to do trauma therapy, and they think that the goal is just to speak it out, but that really isn't. It's the integration of it. So traumatic experiences, they often remain very unintegrated. So that means they're stored as sensory fragments, or there's intrusive memories, or even intrusive feelings, body states, rather than what we would call like a coherent autobiographical memory. So what happens in stage 2 is reconstruction, and this transforms these fragments so that the trauma becomes part of the survivor's life story instead of like this constant, ever-present intruder in their life. So it's a little bit about stage 2. So let's talk a little bit about why this is so important, really fully appreciate stage 2. So remembrance and mourning is essential because we have to understand, first, the clinician has to understand how trauma affects memory at like the neurobiological level. So if you've been listening, there's a lot of podcasts or blogs I've written on this. So just briefly, during a traumatic event, particularly when it involves intense fear, helplessness, prolonged stress, the brain, what happens is its stress response it tends to flood the system with hormones, neurotransmitters like cortisol or adrenaline. And this has a huge impact on the brain. So there's 2 main key areas of the brain. The first is the amygdala, and this is very simplistic. There's many other parts of the brain that are affected in this, but I'm just going to keep this on a very simplistic level. So the first brain region that's key is the amygdala. And so the amygdala is the brain's alarm system. This is at the bottom of your head, and it becomes highly activated. It encodes that emotional intensity and sensory details that the trauma experience as a threat, and it has exceptional strength. So it's kind of encoding it. And this leads to very powerful, easily triggered emotional and physiological responses later. Okay. So the second area is the hippocampus, which is typically responsible for contextualizing memories. So it gives memories a sense of time and place, maybe some narrative coherence, or it thinks it's coherent, but it can be really impaired or even temporarily suppressed under high stress. And so what we can see too in some neuroimaging studies is that it consistently shows how there is reduced hippocampal volume and activity in individuals with active PTSD. So it's pretty fascinating stuff when you dig into the research and you can see on a neurobiological level what is happening to the brain. It's pretty incredible. So the result is that these traumatic memories, they are often stored differently than ordinary memories. So instead of them being like neatly filed away, like something happened in the past, what happens is they remain very fragmented or very sensory driven or emotionally driven. And that, can intrude into like the present. So that could be intrusions of like flashbacks, nightmares, body sensations, irritability, numbness. There's a lot of different ways that this presents. And research, including that of Bessel van der Kolk, everybody talks about him and others, there's more than just him, they describe this as memories remaining stuck in the raw, unprocessed form. And so this aligns a lot with the fear conditioning models. So the brain learns to associate these neutral cues with danger. And without sufficient safety and integration, those associations persist. So again, this is kind of, I'm not going to go too deeply into this. Those that are listening, if you are a survivor, I do just want to remind you that I'm not going to go into graphic details, but at any point you might feel overwhelmed, please just turn this off and seek care. For clinicians, I'm not going to go super deep into this, but I do really suggest you do some of your own research. I do suggest reading Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. Again, this is not for you clients. This book is highly triggering and activating, so I do not want laymen reading this book. Okay, so a critical mechanism that supports healing in this stage is something called memory reconsolidation. And I've talked about this process often in previous blogs and podcasts, so go ahead and dig through everything there of mine. So when a memory is actively recalled in a safe and controlled context, what happens is it becomes kind of like temporarily unstable, like a file getting taken out of a filing cabinet. So during that window, new information, especially safety and updated meaning, can be incorporated back into the memory and restored. It's such a cool process. So this process is supported by research from neuroscientists like Kareem Nader and others, and it provides the scientific foundation for why carefully paced reconstruction can reduce the emotional charge of traumatic memories. So we can think of the process as reorganizing fact. Okay, that's what reconsolidation is. Often, survivors only have bits and pieces of memory, or they can't tell the difference between something that happened or something they feel like they dreamed about. I hear that a lot in session. Like, I think this happened, but I don't know if it was a dream. You hear that a lot. So this reconsolidation process is really key to their healing. So Herman integrates this understanding beautifully in the book. She emphasizes that the survivor has to reconstruct not only what happened, but also what she felt or he felt. Okay, so the emotional states, they really do have to be described with the same detail as the facts. So you can't process a trauma narrative without feeling, if that makes sense. So the emotional states really do have to be described just as deeply and intensely as the facts of what took place. And so then the therapist's role is to help the patient move back and forth between the safe present and the painful past. So you have to really maintain that connection in the present while also allowing intensity of emotions during the processing. So this back and forth is very common when you're doing this trauma work. And for new clinicians, this is very, very important for you to work on, seek consultation on. You can't bulldoze through trauma narration or, different exposure techniques. We'll talk about that. It really does require this back and forth movement because what it happens is it prevents overwhelm of the individual while still allowing that memory to be updated and integrated. You cannot overwhelm the system. So it's precisely this kind of relational process that you're making with this individual. So you titrate. And you can explain this to your client, your patient in front of you, what titration is. You titrate the process. So that is really what distinguishes effective stage 2 work. Because if you are premature and going straight in and you just do some unguided exposure and you don't recognize the insurgence, I guess you could say, of maybe some negative symptomology that's taking place over and above what you would normally see when you're doing a trauma experience, re-experiencing with someone. You have to be able to pull up, go in, pull up, go in, pull up. And so Herman also calls this balance, and I loved when she said this. She says she calls it the balance between the twins of constriction and intrusion. So it's, okay, I'm going to pull back, there's constriction, and now we're going to go into the intrusive thoughts and the memories. So it really is this very delicate dance that the clinician has to be acutely aware of because otherwise they will cause harm. So you have to have, again, this balance also between avoidance of the traumatic memories. We're not avoiding them because that just leads to stagnation, but we're also not moving too quickly or too intensely into the trauma narrative because that can be damaging and fruitless. So clinicians, what I want to say, if you see a client that's highly, highly activated during a trauma narrative, so this might look like something like real dissociative experiences. So might be where they stop moving entirely and they get this 1,000-yard stare. It might be crying that's like bordering on hysteria, so hyperventilation. You have to be so acutely aware. Of course, they are going to be very distressed. But again, we can't get them to such a heightened state because you're just re-traumatizing them. So again, that's why the titration is so important to be aware of this. Also, what I want to say is that it's important to let the clients know that they're not going to perform, I'm using finger quotes right now, at a level that they think is natural. Meaning, often I have individuals that are very high functioning considering they have complex trauma histories, really intense complex trauma histories. And so this is, I'm talking about childhood sexual abuse. This is very common. Physical abuse, childhood physical abuse. We see a lot of this with foster kids that turn into adults, but they're very high functioning. I mean, they've gotten through life, right? So they often come into session with this expectation that they can just do whatever. Like they're tough because they've toughed out all of life. So what I want to say and what I really urge clinicians is I really think spend a lot of time with the client before you go into stage 2, explaining what they might feel like before, during, and after. And really caution running into this too quickly. And it isn't to scare them. I'm not saying that, because what we know in our treatment of trauma, and I'm telling you, this goes all the way back to Freud, speaking the atrocities out allows that reconstruction to happen. And it's very essential to their healing. But you have to prepare them. They can't go into it cavalierly. And I'm not saying they're being cavalier, but they've been so used to gutting out life, and they really typically are very high functioning, that they don't understand how this process is, what it's going to feel like, what it's going to look like. So a lot of times I tell them, I often tell them, like, I'm telling your brain and your body, you and I are stepping into this, that a giant bear is chasing you for the next hour. You can't get through being chased by a bear without any physiological, biological, emotionally driven consequences with that, right? So it's just really important to have that conversation with clients, that they understand that I know you've been through a lot and you've been very strong to this point, but this is a process that we don't jump right into. We go carefully. So I want to talk about some studies on prolonged exposure therapy. Edna Foa actually did some of her work on prolonged grief too, which was really great. So all of her work and her colleagues, they support this kind of process. So in PE, this is prolonged exposure. This is the repeated prolonged engagement with trauma memory. So that's what we call imaginal exposure. So with prolonged exposure, so there's a couple of different ways that you can do this remembrance part. You know, there's the narrative approach, there's a prolonged approach. There's different approaches to how different practitioners, their theoretical lens. So with prolonged exposure, you have that constant engagement with the trauma memory. So that's called imaginal exposure. And then you have avoided situations that we also work in, and that's called in vivo exposure. So that leads to something called habituation and corrective learning. So it's a highly effective process. So what happens is that fear structure is activated, the amygdala, that whole fear network, the neural pathways that are just very tightly wound in that fear network. So it's activated, and then it's modified through these new experiences that they're having with safety and mastery. So there's a lot of meta-analyses that show very strong effect sizes or effects with PE in reducing post-traumatic stress symptoms when you deliver it properly and safely, when that safety foundation, remember, is very solidly there, and also with pacing. Now, the research is also super clear that outcomes are poorer when stage 1 safety is insufficient, or when the exposure is much too intense too soon. In fact, what was really interesting too, just kind of talking about exposure techniques, another one is EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, and it's an exposure technique. Recently, the APA actually moved EMDR down from first line to second line, replacing it with prolonged exposure. And I think that's just because there's much more data on prolonged exposure. And so, again, these are exposure techniques. So in summary, stage 2, it really is a balance of, your clinical wisdom along with some neuroscience. So if you're a clinician listening, it is very, very, very important if you step into truly trauma-informed work where you're going to be stepping into stage 2, you need to understand even on a basic level, what's happening in the brain. This is going to make a huge difference for you explaining some of the effects to the client so you can prepare them and before and after. It's really important that you have that neuroscience with you as well. But what's great about this is that what we're doing is we're reconstructing the story in safety because we've already established, remember, stage 1. So we're helping, it's really cool, we're helping the brain restore context. We're reducing the amygdala activation, those amygdala-driven intrusions, and we're allowing the memory to take its proper place in the past. It really is a really incredible tool, but again, we have to be structured and caring for that human being that came to us. So in talking about Herman's, her triphasic model, I think it's really important to understand that the work in stage 2 is, well, all of it, but really stage 2, this is very in-depth work and it must be precise, meaning that the survivor tells the story completely in depth and in detail. So the reconstruction, basically them telling this story, often what happens is they're talking through it. They may have scant memory. They might have flashes. They might wonder if the memories are true, and that's okay. But as they're narrating it or as they're going through an EMDR process, what happens is reconstruction happens. The mind starts saying, okay, we might allow a little bit more through this. It might not be about the actual traumatic experience. A lot of times, what I find in my exposure sessions in this stage 2 is that people actually get a more formulated memory that bookends the actual traumatic event. So all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I remember the color of my dress. Or, oh my gosh, I can't believe I remember the creak on the stairs. So there's some really interesting things that the brain says, okay, so the brain is really working on that reconstruction process. And it's amazing because it transforms that traumatic memory so that it can be integrated into the survivor story. It is not necessary that the patient remember every single detail. A lot of people don't. The whole point is when we go into these trauma networks is to allow enough space safely for them to start reconstructing what's there. So key elements are these. You must balance the need for safety with the need to face the past. This is 100% a foundational key element if you are going to step into stage 2. Constructing both what happened and what was felt, as I said before. So you're asking an individual when you're in there, what are you seeing? What are you smelling? What are you sensing? If you're doing an EMDR process and they don't want to do speaking, then you're preparing that client before you go into the exposure, that you're saying to them as much detail as you can find. Because again, we cannot just recount, just speak it out. A lot of people with considerable trauma, they just speak it out, and they speak it out with no feeling or emotion. And so my job is to encourage the senses, because that's what's going to help open that network effectively. And especially, I encourage some small details or to remember, especially if that's an early age, things like, well, did you have a favorite stuffed animal? And we'll go to the memory of a favorite stuffed animal. And a lot of times kiddos have that favorite stuffed animal, which is their safe space. So often we'll talk about the favorite stuffed animal outside of exposure, and then the stuffed animal is a memory within the trauma narrative. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about, all kinds of things like, well, what does the carpet look like? All of that. So you have to keep in mind, clinicians, that a trauma narrative, it does not have everything else involved in it. It's going to have bodily sensations, and it has to be complete. So you have to construct what both happened and what was felt. So you need to encourage the client into feeling. Without the affect, like I said, Freud said, there's nothing will take place. It's fruitless. So there must be kind of this painstaking attention to detail and feeling, the detail of feelings and facts. So we're integrating both of those. The next thing that really comes up in this stage 2 that we'll kind of dig into is navigating the existential crisis that really does come up during processing, after processing, because the survivor, I love what Herman said. She said the survivor is called to function as a theologian, a philosopher, and a jurist. So they're confronting evil, they're confronting making meaning, they're confronting justice, and they're confronting shattered assumptions of the world. So they are having to step into new roles, and it is very much an existential crisis. A core piece of the process, or often what is described as like the debrief of remembrance sessions, I call it debrief, is the idea of going in. We're not trying to encourage continued processing. What we're doing, because remember that reconstruction process, we're reconstructing a memory. So a lot of times in this debrief, that's where the survivor is encouraged to articulate their values and beliefs. So possibly values and beliefs that maybe the trauma took from them and destroyed, or this is the big one, what values and beliefs they have received despite the trauma taking place or the evils that were afflicted against them. So it's a pretty intense experience, the existential part. It's also one of the most amazing pieces that I see with clients. When they tip into existential, it's incredibly painful. And we actually, once we get to the existential part, we go to safety a lot. With my clients, we sit there for a second and we go back because they need a lot of time to contemplate, what am I going to be today? The theologian, the philosopher, the jurist. What can I do today? So it takes a lot of time. But I'll say when they start putting the pieces together, that's incredible. When you really see that reconstruction start, it's pretty incredible to see. So in that process, they're facing the questions of like, why me? And those questions, they often don't even have satisfying answers, but they have to be wrestled with. They are essential to be wrestled with. And that existential part is going to be huge in the recovery of the patients that come see you. So one thing I do want to talk about is it's a really important dimension that often emerges in existential work, and something that I'm working with is something called moral injury. So the concept of moral injury was first described in about the 1990s by clinicians working with Vietnam vets. So it was a guy named Jonathan Shea and others. But we've since expanded. It's not just Vietnam vets, it's active military, healthcare, civilian trauma context. But let me explain what moral injury is. So moral injury happens when a person experiences, they might witness, or they might participate in an event or something that's taking place that violates their deeply held moral or ethical beliefs. It goes against their values. So what moral injury looks like is it's characterized by profound feelings of guilt and shame and betrayal, self-condemnation, and a lot of loss of meaning or trust in their self or others, or even in institutions. So what's interesting with this existential part, clinicians, if you're listening, if you find you're kind of hitting up against a wall, because stereotypical parameters for PTS work, you just can't seem to get there, I really suggest that you start doing some reading on moral injury. Again, Jonathan Shea is great. I studied under Dr. Koenig. This is important because this, I think, has really fulfilled or really opened my eyes to, this is the thing that I kept bumping into. So what happens is moral injury, it is distinct from PTS, but it's very frequently co-occurring. So PTS is primarily that fear-based response, right, rooted in threats to their physical safety. So it might be involving hyperarousal, intrusions, or avoidance driven by the sense that I'm in danger. Now, moral injury, by contrast, is value-based wound. So it centers around the question, am I still a good person? How can I live with what I've seen or I've done? So it really often leads to a spiritual or existential distress. So you might see this with withdrawal in relationships, definitely a shattered sense of self, and it goes far beyond fear. So in stage 2, moral injury frequently surfaces the survivor's confrontation with those questions of like, why and why me? So these questions often, they don't have any answers, yet they really do have to wrestle with it. So for many, like with trauma, involved not only fear, but profound moral violations. So whether it's acts of betrayal, failures to protect, or situations where their own actions or inactions violated core values. We see this a lot, unfortunately, with military, because they're being asked to carry out orders. You can see this in healthcare workers, same thing there. And we can also see this with victims of childhood abuse. So I want to bring that attention to your attention, clinicians, and even if anybody out there is listening and saying there's just the PTSD there's something missing, inform yourself, what's moral injury? And then find a clinician that knows what moral injury is. There's some really great assessments that you can also use. And again, I use all Harold Koenig stuff, but it really helps because we can reconstruct that story in this stage. We can still do it with moral injury, and it allows the survivor to actually now examine the moral dimensions and then grieve them and then begin that slow process of moral repair, self-forgiveness where it's appropriate and where they need to go. Okay, so moral injury is something that I've seen a lot of, and I've integrated into the work with trauma. So just wanted to go kind of a little bit on that. Existential questions, oftentimes, if you have a client that's really stuck in that spot, I really encourage you to start looking into moral injury. All right, so Herman, she emphasizes that the therapist role, this is very, very important. We're going to really talk about this one, is in that moment to serve as open-minded, compassionate witness, period. What I'm saying in that as well is know your audience. Compassion toward your patient is different for maybe a very tender-hearted woman as opposed to a very higher ranking military individual, okay? So if you're super compassionate and you're showing it all over your face because the woman that, like I'm giving very generalized descriptions, needs it, it's not going to be applicable to the other individual. Does that make sense? So know your audience. So through the truth telling and that testimony, again, that trauma story, it becomes so present and so real. And so what's really wonderful about that too is that we're allowing them to restore a sense of dignity with that, allowing the survivor to reclaim agency in their own narrative. And it's so key, and we'll talk about this in stage 3. Reclaiming agency is key. We start talking about agency, autonomy, post-traumatic growth within the first couple sessions that I'm talking to them about that, because I want them to know this is where we're going. Another really important piece of stage 2 is mourning. It really is. It is absolutely central to the remembrance. Survivors must grieve. Not only like the trauma itself, but the losses it created. So the loss of a childhood, the trust of others, opportunities, sense of self, or maybe even the illusion of a predictable, just world, right? So grief is absolutely essential. We have to allow the grief process, and avoiding it cuts the survivor off from a really important part of healing. Do not rush the grief process. Don't rush it. We want them to function through it. But again, we don't want to rush stage 2. And that's not just remembrance. That's not just the exposure part. It's also the grieving part. We need to allow them to mourn. And what I can say to clinicians, one of the hardest things, I think, I can listen to the narration of these traumas. I can sit there and be present and be that compassionate witness. I will tell you when I see these individuals that are just incredibly strong, and they break down, shattered that mourning process. It's hard. It's hard as a clinician to hold that, because gosh, you see the mourning in such a different way. And so just be prepared for it, because boy, is it hard. Because we're not in this business because we're heartless, right? So your heartstrings are definitely going to get tugged when you step into the grieving. So the therapist role is really clear. You bear witness with like a moral solidarity, like I'm with you. You help them without imposing interpretations. You don't rush into fact finding, and you do not attempt to magically erase the pain. The work of stage 2 is integration, not erasure. That cannot happen. And that's another thing I talk to people about a lot, is that we are doing this work, but I cannot make the trauma go away. The trauma is there. What we're doing is allowing the brain to reconstruct it, so it's not actively living as if it's happening today, right? Okay, so here's some exposure approaches, and I've already kind of touched on this. So modern treatment, trauma treatment, offered some very constructive ways and structured ways for us to do this restructuring process, and I've already touched on this. So there's PE, prolonged exposure, very well researched, and like I said, APA just put it to the first line treatment. And so in prolonged exposure, it involves the repeated, prolonged engagement with trauma memories. This is called imaginal exposure, okay? And what I can say with that is that prolonged exposure can have a tendency to be more uncomfortable for people because they're speaking out, whereas with EMDR, they don't necessarily speak it out. It's just up to the person. But it's a tough process, right? They go into the memory and they speak it out and they tell you the details, and it might take 30 seconds and they have to go again. So it's over and over and over again. It's still exposing the brain to increase that process of habituation and turning down that fear signal. There's a lot of research, including some large trials with sexual assault survivors and veterans, showing that PE really does significantly reduce PTSD symptoms when again, it's delivered safely and it's established with that proper pacing. Proper pacing, you have to be careful. You have to understand that exposure must be titrated carefully. When you prematurely jump in or you flood them, it can overwhelm their nervous system, and this is when they won't come back. Now, you can be really good at titration and they still won't come back, which has happened to me as well. Like I said, other approaches. So that's the narrative therapy. You can do the narrative therapy, which is highly effective. EMDR is very effective. I'm kind of, a lot of people think it's kind of like a magic wand. So a lot of people come to me and they say, well, I want EMDR. And they think we just go straight into it. And it's a much more in-depth situation than that. And then there's some somatic methods. Just be very aware. Just make sure that your professional has the expertise in some of these, because when it comes to trauma-informed care, you can see some charlatans in this area. You really can. There was something called Rebirth that came out where the therapist has a client reenact their birth. It's highly traumatizing. And so you'll see it with different organizations now, like, we will not work with you if this is your approach. So be very careful, do your homework, just like with any therapist, though, really. So both the therapist and the client, they really do have to have a deep understanding and respect for the need for really careful pacing in this stage. You just have to. So many individuals, like I said, that are high functioning, they just come in and they're like, I want to do the work. I want to do it right now. And they might, come in and say, Piper, I want to do EMD right now, as if they're ordering off a menu, right? But I have to explain to them, for stage 2 to be effective, I cannot rush in, nor can I be dictated by the client's desire for speed. That's not how this works. Safety from stage 1, it has to be solidly established. It has to be, and it has to be continually monitored. So when we do premature exposure, no matter how motivated the client feels, it really does risk overwhelming the nervous system and undermining the process. Clients also need to understand that this is not simply a cognitive or verbal process. A lot of people think that. It is a profound physiological and emotional undertaking that really does require well-developed safety mechanisms, regulation skills, and that really strong relationship with the therapist. So the pacing has to be guided, watching the survivor's window of tolerance, and it's not by enthusiasm by them. It's really, we have to monitor it by what we're seeing in there. And again, you cannot have a client determine when they begin stage 2. So one of the things that's really important to clinicians and those listening, if you think you're going to be going into exposure work, stage 2 with a clinician, that's great. It sounds like you've probably got a solid stage 1. If your clinician hasn't spent an inordinate amount of time in stage 1, I really, really caution you from going straight into stage 2. So stage 1, again, this is building the therapeutic relationship with you and your therapist, but you really do need to have regulation skills. There's some really great skills that we teach when we use EMDR, like the container, putting in a safe person. But you need those skills because this is much different than you probably are anticipating. So one of the important things too to talk to people about is that there are some after effects. And I call it the post-processing slump. So after a very deep remembrance session, understand that there's significant neurological activity that continues outside of the therapy room. So what we do is we prepare the client. Do not do any deep processing on your own. And again, this is why stage 1 is so important. You teach them about how to observe emotion and memory rather than participate. We give them a lot of regulation skills because that's hard. I mean, when you go through a trauma session, a remembrance session, you want to kind of dig back in. So what happens is, like during our remembrance session, that memory reconsolidation opens up, right? That temporary window in the brain of that activated trauma memory. And it becomes kind of, like I tell my clients, like a colander. And so what happens with that is then we start updating it. Things can come out, things can go in. So what can happen is it starts becoming updated with new safety and meaning, just simply because they were in that room, you taught them, you walked them through with regulation skills and that sort of thing. So the neuroplastic process, neuroplasticity, this is the brain's ability to form and strengthen new neural connections. That does not stop when the session ends at all. So this happens for many hours. And what we know is it happens up to 48 hours afterward. So what happens is the brain, it's continuing to integrate that material at a very, very deep level. So this is kind of like the behind the scenes work that is absolutely metabolically demanding. It is. So clients often, I tell them, like I give them a worksheet, like just remember this you're supposed to feel this way. So oftentimes they'll experience what some clinicians, like I said, call the post-processing slump. So that's like a profound fatigue. They're so exhausted. Mental fog. They might have emotional sensitivity. They might go back into very vivid dreams. So you will see typically a temporary increase in symptoms. This is expected. Because the slump, it's not a setback. It's a normal sign that the brain is actively rewiring pathways, okay? It's reducing the emotional charge of that memory, and it's moving this kind of fragmented material into a more coherent or contextualized narrative, okay? So the nervous system is also recalibrating. What's so very important after a deep remembrance session is you've got to rest. You've got to hydrate. You really do. You need to do all your gentle grounding processes. You got to reduce the general demands on your day. There's no alcohol or drugs. You cannot, because that's going to greatly diminish that neuroplasticity that's taking place in your mind, in your brain. It demands during this period that you have those supports in process, like with the process. So this is, again, another part of safety is, who are my supports? What can I do for support? You have to have this, because understanding this phenomenon, they have to understand when you leave here, you are going to be exhausted. I remember one client, we had an intense remembrance session. And as they're walking out, they say, oh yeah, I'm going to meet some friends for lunch. I'm like, oh my gosh. And I said, oh, okay. Please don't drink. And if you're driving, maybe have your friends pick you up, or because you're going to feel really exhausted. And wouldn't you know, they came back the week later and was like, I should not have done that. I'm like, yeah, it probably jumped on you the second you started eating, your belly got full, and it was like, you're out. And they said, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. So you got to really maintain that, hey, I need to hunker down, I need to take care of me, and really avoid the external pressures to step out of that, because this is really important for you, because it is hard work. It really is. It is not just narrating your trauma. It is a full system online, a full physiological change. And why go through this and then kind of short circuit by drinking or doing whatever it is? You don't want to keep doing this forever. So just be aware, clinicians, you're not doing anything wrong when you see that slump. It's very, very common. With my long-term clients, my complex clients, I'll see their scores from month to month go up and down, up and down, up and down. But I also can correlate it to, our remembrance sessions, or like what's going on in their life. I track all of that. So this is a really good opportunity to talk to them about state versus trait, because you don't want them to have like, oh my gosh, I'm failing. No, you're doing great. This is to be expected. So education on this post-processing slump is really, really key. Okay, so I want to go over some red flags. Red flags for clinicians. Number one, moving into detailed trauma reconstruction or any sort of exposure-based work before the client has demonstrated like their consistent internal and external safety is a no-go. That you gotta be aware of this. It doesn't matter how bad that client says, I can do this, I want to start this right now. If you have 1 ounce of like, ooh, I don't know, then you don't do it. Number two, pushing for breakthroughs. Don't do that. Or like really rapid processing because the client appears high functioning or requests this. I will say, however, there's a lot of work on something called flooding. Flooding can be highly effective. There's a lot of research on it. They've done a lot of post-traumatic like flooding. And I think they can do it in about 12 to 14 sessions. I'm trying to remember some of the studies. Flooding is absolutely intense. And so if you go into a flooding session and the clinician actually knows what flooding is, then you've had copious amount of time to figure out stage one. Okay. If clinicians, you are pushing for a breakthrough or this rapid processing, then I would really say you need to consider who you're doing this work for. Them or for you. So just be aware of that. The other thing is number three, the failing to titrate the work. Clinicians, you have got to titrate the work. So if you go too deep, too fast, or for too long in a single session, again, you're going to overwhelm that nervous system and it's going to be a fruitless session for that individual's, shift in that memory. So really practice titration. And again, titration is kind of going in and coming out, and so you're keeping that individual's nervous system, they're keyed up, but we don't want them to go into like 100% and higher of tolerance, that because they're not tolerating. So window of tolerance, you're going to have to determine that with the client. I use a thermometer to talk about like our levels of tolerance. And so we are identifying levels of tolerance and intolerance in safety in stage one. So it's really important to understand that. Next thing, number 4, if you become overly focused on the content, like getting the story. What I will say is when you start listening to these, you're going to be very confused because you're going to be like, wait, what I don't understand what took place. It is not your job to fill in the gaps for them. In fact, that's wrong to do. That's not your job. We don't fill in the gaps. We remember we're the compassionate witness. We listen, and we might say things like, if they're doing a prolonged exposure, their first narration might be totally different from the 6th or 7th within a session. And I take notes the whole time, and I might pick up clues like, wow, first narration said this, 7th said this. Did you notice the shift in how this made you feel, like within your body? So approaching it that way, not saying, well, let's figure out what this is about. You need to encourage the client to consider, what did I feel when I found this new evidence? Or gosh, I didn't realize I said that. Let them sit on that. Let them sit on that, because you cannot be overly focused on getting the story and neglect that client's moment to moment window of tolerance or arousal levels or dissociative responses. In the debrief, don't focus on getting the story. Focus on, if nothing else, that meaning making. Remember, those existential questions are coming. You can point out things that might be different, or even if you're doing an EMDR session and you're not hearing anything, just say, considering when you came in here today, and how you were feeling there, any new sensations that you noticed today. So we're really focusing. Remember, it's not just about the story, it's about the sense, the feeling, the bodily sensations. So we want to try to bring them in, because that does maximize that reconstruction process. Okay. Please, clinicians, don't minimize or discourage clients for their need to return to safety. Okay. Stage 1. Please don't. If they need to go back when their symptoms feel too intense for them, then your job is to say, yes, I'll take you there. Now, again, we can't have avoidance, because avoidance just prolongs this. But there's a difference where the client says, this is too intense. I can't, even if it's like 5 days after the session and they still have intrusive symptoms, absolutely, let's go back to safety. I've done that many times. We would have a remembrance session. We don't go into another remembrance session until like 6-7 weeks later. Okay. And that's okay. That is okay, because this is not about you getting somewhere with the client. This is about the client and their reconstruction process in the safest way possible for themselves. Okay. And another thing too, please do not treat stage 2 as like this linear checklist, rather than like a very collaborative, flexible process. Just because you're the clinician that knows the tools, the exposure tools, whatever it may be, don't forget that human being has survived through this. They know them. Yes, they want your expertise. But if you start just treating them like a checklist, I'm telling you, it's gonna have no effect on them. They'll pick it up. So be very, very careful, clinicians. Okay, red flags for clients and survivors. I want to say this. Please, 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 clients and survivors, or even family members, a red flag is insisting on jumping straight into intensive modalities, such as EMDR and prolonged exposure, before there's any safety and regulation skills that are solidly in place. Do not, family, friends, even those listening that think they need this help, you cannot insist on jumping straight in. I know you just want to get it done and rip off the Band-Aid, but you really, please trust the clinician. Please trust the clinician. Do not minimize or deny any current symptoms or life instability with statements like, I'm fine, let's just get this over with. I understand that that's your way of saying, okay, I'm just scared, I want to get through this, but it is very, very important that we do not deny, avoid, compartmentalize what's taking place, because I can't monitor and provide you the care if we're not totally open. And that's why, too, stage 1 is all about building that relationship with your clinician. It is so key, so key. The third one is avoiding the emotional and sensory details, okay, of a memory. I know a lot of people want to just stay in the cognitive, like factual recounting. And I can see them just kind of, go through and they're just like, it's like their checklist. Like, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say this. And they'll say things like, yep, see, I can recount it. you are prolonging the process. I will share a little bit about my own story. As I was a rape victim, I guess I just don't think of myself as that person anymore. But for so many years, about 20, I did some work, and then it went away, I guess you could say. And I was able to recall what took place with me, there was no emotion to it. It was fine. Nothing, no big deal. And I was very almost flippant about that. And I have a pretty big amount of shame because I think, what if there were other rape survivors and I was talking that way? But all that to be said, what was really interesting about that is I had been avoiding those emotional responses. And wouldn't you know, about 25 years after the rape, my brain decided to open up a lot of memories I didn't particularly want. And that does happen sometimes. So recognize when, if you are kind of emotionally blunting things, that, okay, this is probably a safety mechanism. We understand that. But if you only stay at this very cognitive or factual recounting of the event, we're not going to have the full force of that restructuring process behind what you're doing. So just be aware of that. Next one is, you cannot, family, friends, individuals that are wondering about this, you cannot expect a rapid resolution. You just can't. You can't do one giant big session to clear the trauma. Now, the caveat to that is that there's trauma intensives, which I do. There are trauma retreats, but you have to keep in mind these retreats, these intensives, we're in session processing for up to 5 hours a day. Okay, so it's not one just like 1 hour, 2 hour session. I mean, we're processing for days at a time. So please be aware that, especially with EMDR, I think people think that it's a magic wand. It's not. It's just a effective tool for exposure. It doesn't rapidly resolve. In fact, you might get frustrated if you go in like, why am I not better? The counselor sucks. And okay, maybe the counselor does suck, but if you're going in with that, I have to get this fixed now. If you go in with it like that kind of expectation, you're going to be really upset. Okay. Another big thing that I think is important for those who are considering stage 2 or exposure remembrance sessions, or family and friends, is that oftentimes we'll see people become really discouraged and self-critical during that normal post-processing slump. Okay, so they might be interpreting fatigue or other temporary symptoms as a failure. So please be compassionate to self, people that are listening, and then friends and family. This is where you step in as that safety and that support. This is where you do not say, oh, stop, you're being so critical of yourself. It's just, boy, this must be really hard. I can't imagine what that session was like. Do not try to discourage them or their self-criticism, because you're just going to shame them. They're already suffering within the shame that does typically come along with trauma. And here's the other thing, clients, please don't withdraw. Don't keep canceling sessions. Have a conversation. I understand that this is emotionally and physically demanding. I would much rather you cancel the remembrance session and still come into session and have time with me. We'll just go back to stage 1. We'll have conversations what's in stage 1. This is the titration process. This is the dance that we need to do. But if you withdraw and you hide from me, I can't help. And I know sometimes it feels better sometimes, but it really does prolong what's going on. Okay. So really, truly stage 2 work, it requires patience and honesty and massive collaboration between the therapist and the client. So when these red flags appear, what I want to say is it really is a signal to slow down, strengthen safety, strengthen the clinical toolbox, whatever it is, and reassess rather than push through. Don't push through. Really important, don't push through. What I want to really repeat too, and I believe I said this in stage 1 when we talked about that, is that the triphasic model is not a straight line. It is not linear. Survivors commonly cycle back to stage 1, even when they're even past stage 2 and they're in stage 3, okay? So remembrance work, that stirs up those really intense emotions, and then maybe life stressors, chime in, and, new layers of memory might resurface. So returning to safety is not regression, because again, the triphasic model is not linearity. It is not. Safety is not a regression. Safety is an intelligent, very protective and necessary part of the process, of the healing process. Very necessary. There is no such thing as regression. Now, what I will say is if you're going to stage 2, you're flooding, you're not being cautious, and they massively regress in symptoms and stuff, then that's regression, but that's on the clinician's part. That's their fault. So a lot of people move fluidly between the stages, okay? And it's important to do that and to be open to that. Now, I'm going to close up because I know this is a long one today. I'd be absolutely irresponsible if I did not address the clinician side of this work. I've talked about the expectation of being an expert, trauma-informed, understand triphasic model, understand solidly what tool you're using in remembrance, have a really solid theoretical framework, all of the things. But this is what I need to say. In stage 2, the therapist must possess, this is not I don't know. No, you must possess the emotional capacity and self-awareness to hold steady, to hold that compassionate space for that survivor's pain without you becoming overwhelmed and disassociating yourself. I have seen this. I have been in training when I was in my training, and a therapist that was in training themselves talked the whole group training about disassociating on the client. That is so wrong, and it's so unethical, and that just, you cannot do that. So stage 2, or this work in trauma, really requires that the clinician has done substantial personal work on their own, and that they understand their history or their triggers. And every therapist should know which types of stories or material that they can't listen to or they have difficulty listening to. Okay, whether it involves betrayal or violence, moral injury, young children, elderly, floods, earthquakes, prostitution. I'm kind of trying to go through the things in my mind. You have to know which types of story or material you have difficulty listening to. You have to know, because you have to have strategies in place to manage your response. So this is not the time, clinicians, for you to play Superman or Superwoman. It is not. You have to remain acutely aware of your own fears, of your countertransference, and limits, so that you can absolutely stay present and grounded while the client is doing this demanding work. When a therapist can't tolerate the material, I'm telling you, this is highly unethical. And you must seek consultation, engage in your own supervision or therapy, I'm not even going to say I'm going to say you need to refer that client to someone who's better equipped to handle that particular story. There's no shame in saying, gosh, I didn't see this. This can happen too. Maybe you're like, yeah, I've done the work. I know the things. And something comes up and you're like, and it just hits you upside the head. Okay, that happens too. You're not a bad therapist. You just didn't see around the corner on that one. But you must refer out to someone else and seek consultation, because you will cause more harm if you continue in that process, because you're not going to be able to hold the space. You can't be zoning out when a client's telling their story. You can't do it. So if this is the work that you love and you're in it, then you understand the natural exhaustion that comes with it. Our clients are absolutely going through all the emotionally and physiologically demanded work in phase 2, as are you. So you really need to set up those processes for yourself. How are you going to work with this material? How do you keep it out of your mind? I'm not saying you avoid it particularly, but you need to come up with a process. You need to come up with a way to set this down. This is not my story. This is theirs. Again, if you get highly triggered, maybe it's just broke your heart. That's okay. Like, you're a human being, but always, always, always have someone that you can seek consultation with. I am so enormously blessed that I have some really awesome people that I can turn to and say, hey, this was a really tough situation. I just, I could use a listening ear, and I only go to trauma clinicians with it. I won't go to my girlfriend who's an OCD expert because she doesn't listen to this stuff. I don't want to re-traumatize her. But I go to other trauma clinicians and I'm just like, how do you hold space for X, Y, and Z? I'm not giving details, but it's just like, okay, this was so heavy for me. I feel like I was in the ring and I had a 12 match fight. I'm battered and bruised, and what do I do now? Because this one was toughy. So always find trauma clinicians for that consultation, because they get it and they will have, I would say, superior advice in how do we bracket, what are some of the things that you need to do afterward. You'll learn a lot in school. They're like, do self-care. It's really not helpful. Universities could do a lot better with that. Just do self-care. It's not bubble baths, y'all. It's not. So again, find those individuals that you can, save on your phone and that you call in those situations. But again, please, 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 clinicians, if you're listening, you have to be able to have the emotional capacity and self-awareness to hold this. You have to. And so even like with my mentees, I have them do a checklist of like, what populations and things are you willing to work with? What are the things that you're like, no, I can't go there? I mean, I make them think about it. And sometimes they giggle at me. I'm like, oh no, believe me, you need to be prepared for this, And so it's really important. And I just felt like I really needed to discuss that today. Okay. So that's today. It's a long one. Stage 2, it's a long one. So remembrance and mourning is extraordinarily courageous work. It is for the client and it is for the clinician. It allows the trauma to move from something that defines and intrudes upon their life to this painful but integrated part of their history. That's why it's extraordinary, y'all. Like, they do stage 2 and gosh, you just want to save them from it, right? But they've already lived it. But it's this courageous work of them saying, I'm doing this, I'm going in there, and I'm going to integrate this into part of my history where it no longer lives alive and it doesn't intrude in my life today. It's so extraordinary. And so I want you to hold that courage for people that come to you and those that are listening. I listen to these stories and I'm like, how are they here? How are they upright? How have they survived? I am in astonished gratitude that they're sitting in front of me. That's what stage 2 is. That's truly what it is. Okay, so next episode, we are going to explore stage 3, and this is reconnection, and this is a beautiful, wonderful part 2. So reconnection is really about rebuilding their life and relationships and meaning after trauma. So I have kind of a gentle reflection question for those of you that are listening. If you're approaching this stage, so going into remembrance, what aspects feel the most important right now? Is it putting words to the story? Is it mourning specific losses? Or is it that you simply need to be witnessed in safety? What is it? Bring that to your therapist. Answer this and then bring it to them and say, this is what I really need from you right now. You know you. We are doing everything we can to help you, but gosh, really consider what most do you need going into stage 2. So again, there's going to be resources at the end in the show notes. Please, please, please don't do this life alone. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 800-799-7233. You can also call the Georgia Crisis and Access Line at 1-800-715-4225. or you can text the crisis hotline at text HOME, HOME, to 741-741. Don't do this alone. There's a clinician out there for you. Clinicians, kick ass and take names, do all the studying you can, and you be there and you hold this space for these incredible, incredible survivors. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you more next time. That brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I hope you learned some tools that can equip you to untangle your mind and untangle your life. If you're curious about working with me for your anxiety or trauma, head on over to my website at untangledmind.net to connect with me. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review me on your podcast listening platform and share it with your friends and family. As always, thanks so much for listening to me, Piper Harris, with the Untangled Mind podcast. I'll talk with you next time.